Imagine a hallway washed in dim gray light, the kind that slips through a window during a long power outage. The air feels still. You can hear the muffled hum of an empty refrigerator, the soft creaks of a settling building, and then something different. Voices next door, movement, a presence that wasn't there yesterday. In moments like this, the mind asks a sharp, unexpected question. What happens when unfamiliar people take over a neighboring space and the systems we rely on aren't responding? This episode explores the scientific idea behind that feeling, how human environments, when left unregulated, shift into new patterns of behavior that can seem threatening even when the mechanisms behind them are often more predictable and more explainable than they appear. In the next few minutes, we'll examine what actually happens inside a community when an abandoned home or apartment is occupied by people who aren't supposed to be there, and why the situation feels magnified when normal support systems are delayed or unavailable. This isn't a guide, and it isn't about confrontation. It's a sketch-based explanation of how environments behave, how human perception responds to uncertainty, and how calm understanding can replace fear. You'll see how sound, light, temperature, and even simple crowd psychology shape the way moments like this unfold. Think of this as stepping back from the scene and quietly drawing its underlying lines. What actually happens when a neighboring space becomes suddenly occupied by new people, especially those who arrive without notice? The environment around you changes in subtle yet noticeable ways. These changes often create the impression of danger long before any real information is known. Inside the structure next door, the basic physics of occupancy shift: more movement, more heat output, more vibration through walls and floors. Even the airflow inside a building changes when every window, door, or vent is opened or closed by someone new. It's like adding new brushstrokes to a sketch. The lines of quiet domestic life gain extra texture you weren't expecting. From a scientific view, this is a transition from a low-activity system to a higher-activity one. Every home has its own acoustic fingerprint, a blend of silence, plumbing echoes, refrigerator cycles, and human routines. When outsiders enter and start living there, that acoustic fingerprint changes. Nothing about this mechanism is inherently violent. It's simply the physics of human presence. But when the environment is already stressed, like during a blackout, or a period when official services are delayed, any new variable feels more significant. Researchers studying urban environments notice that people interpret unfamiliar sounds during outages far more intensely than during normal conditions. In a well-lit, stable city block, a thumper laugh from the next house might barely register. In a dim, silent corridor during a grid-down moment, that same sound becomes a spotlight. So what is actually happening when looters or unauthorized occupants take a neighboring space? A system resets, a building that was dormant becomes active. The patterns shift, and your brain, wired for detecting change, notices every deviation. Why it feels worse than it is when the power grid fades or emergency services are slow. The human mind switches into a mode psychologists sometimes call pattern vigilance. It's not fear, it's heightened attention. The brain begins scanning for irregularities because irregularities help us understand what's happening around us. This internal system is ancient. When we can't rely on external signals like street lights, distant traffic noise, or the reassurance of quick official response, we rely more on our own senses. But our senses are not neutral recorders. They bend information toward caution. That's why a quiet footstep next door suddenly feels like a deliberate intrusion, even when it might simply be someone walking around. It's why murmured conversation becomes planning even though you can't hear the words. The mind fills in blanks with its own sketches. shading the unknown parts darker than reality. Researchers studying crisis perception note that humans tend to overestimate threat when three conditions combine: low lighting, limited information, absence of authoritative structure. When all three happen at once, the environment itself becomes a kind of amplifier. And there's another factor: community silence. In normal circumstances, neighborhoods act like slow-moving information networks. People talk, observe, and check on each other. When utilities fail or emergency systems lag, these networks weaken. Without that communal flow, each home becomes its own isolated island. Isolation magnifies imagination. The mind tries to connect dots, but without data. It sketches lines that feel heavier than the situation may actually warrant. So the feeling that things are worse than they are often comes not from the new neighbors themselves, but from how the environment changes your perception of them. The hidden science behind it. Let's break the moment down into the quiet sciences that shape it. Temperature shifts first. When a new group enters a vacant space, their body heat changes how air circulates. Warmer air rises through stairwells and vents. Cooler pockets sink. You may feel subtle differences in your own home, tiny drafts, or stillness because the building's airflow dynamics have been altered. Buildings behave like slow-moving breathing systems, inhaling and exhaling warmth. Light also plays a role. During grid-down moments or blackouts, even a single flashlight beam leaking through a window can feel exaggerated, like a signal or message. But in physics terms, the environment is simply reintroducing points of contrast. Human eyes, accustomed to rich lighting cues, read these small contrasts as meaningful. Sound is the most powerful factor. In quiet environments, sound waves travel farther and with more clarity. A dropped object may echo through empty rooms next door. A conversation may seem closer than it is because the walls, now cooler and more rigid without active heating systems, transmit vibration differently. The result is a strange phenomenon. You hear more while knowing less. Finally, there's the system-level view. Neighborhoods are like grids of energy, sound, light, and movement. When one node of that grid changes especially abruptly, it affects the others. You're not reacting to them as much as you're reacting to the grid recalibrating. In blackout science, we often see that the presence of unauthorized occupants in a structure transforms not just that structure, but the entire sensory map of the surrounding area. This doesn't mean danger, it means change, and change often masquerades as a threat until the environment stabilizes enough for perception to catch up with reality. What this means for you, the most important takeaway is that your environment is sending you strong signals, but those signals don't automatically equal danger. They reflect activity, not intention. The world around you is adjusting to new patterns. Your senses are tuned to notice more intensely during moments when systems are quiet or unreliable. Understanding this shift helps the mind stay steady. Instead of interpreting every sound or shadow as an escalation, it becomes possible to view them part of the natural behavior of buildings. Airflow, acoustics, and human presence. Staying mentally steady doesn't mean ignoring the situation. It means observing it through a calmer lens. Noticing how sound travels, noting how light changes, recognizing how a silent street amplifies even harmless noise. It also helps to remember that human occupancy is often less dramatic than the imagination paints. Most activity in a newly occupied home, authorized or not, is ordinary. Talking, moving, resting, exploring a space. By understanding the environmental science behind the moment, you gain a wider frame, a sketch, rather than a spotlight. A series of shifting shadows and sounds that make sense once you understand the physics behind them. So the core lesson is simple. When unfamiliar people take over a neighboring space and the usual systems aren't responding, your environment changes first long before you know anything about the people themselves. Light, sound, airflow, and psychology blend into a portrait that can feel sharper than it really is. Understanding those layers turns uncertainty into clarity. It turns noise into information. It turns a tense moment into a scientific sketch of how neighborhoods behave under stress. If you want to explore more about how the world changes when the grid goes quiet, join us in the next episode of The Zero Grid.